Section 3, a chronology of deaths in the Epstein network. This section will cover every individual who has been linked to the Epstein scandal and how they have died. Many of these people were implicated as having been a part of Epstein's network in an illegal way, but there are also some victims as well. Point number 23, death number 1. The earliest death I could find related to the Epstein PDF file ring other than Robert Maxwell, who I will discuss in a later point, was a fashion model from Kazakhstan named Ruslana Korshunova. Ruslana had a very quick rise within the fashion industry during the mid-2000s, modeling for magazine publications such as Vogue, as well as various clothing brands including Vera Wang and Nina Ricci. Although that was cut short when she was found dead at the age of 20 on June 28, 2008. Somehow, she had fallen from the balcony of her 9th-story apartment. Authorities quickly ruled this a suicide, with this Reuters article coming out well within 48 hours of Ruslana's death. Then, 6 years later in 2014, a book was published by a British journalist by the name of Peter Pomerantsev titled Nothing is True and Everything is Possible: The Surreal Heart of the New Russia, in which he investigated the dark corners of Moscow's high society. While the book mainly focuses on Russian politics, this book has an entire chapter dedicated to Ruslana. In this chapter, he details how Ruslana had actually been sucked into some sort of self-help cult called Rose of the World, which had been imposing severe psychological pressure on her. In 2014, the media picked up on this quickly, with the Herald Sun writing this article where they summarize the author's words, saying, quote, suffering from insomnia and losing weight, Korshunova's modeling career, which had taken her to London, Paris, and Milan, began to suffer and bookings dried up. It was then that she fell into the clutches of the Moscow-based Rose of the World cult, Pomerantsev says. The author joined the cult to get first-hand experience, and he claims one of the life coaches talked about the supermodel's death, unquote. So we see that at some point, Ruslana's mental health started to decline. She ended up with insomnia and was losing weight, which may have affected her career. What I'm wondering is, what started Ruslana's mental issues? And, well, that brings us to 2024, where we find out now that 2 years prior to the time of her death, Ruslana took the Lolita Express to Jeffrey Epstein's island. So was the reason for the mental health decline of the up-and-coming fashion model due to her own decisions? Was it the Rose of the World cult, or was the cult just a symptom of a mind in decline? Perhaps it was her visit to Epstein Island. Did she actually kill herself? I'll let you be the judge. Point number 24, death number 2. The second person in the list of deaths was a man named Alfredo Rodriguez, who died on December 28, 2014. During the mid-2000s, Alfredo was serving as Jeffrey Epstein's butler and house manager at Epstein's Palm Beach estate in Florida. If you have been following the Epstein story since 2019, you've likely seen this house at 358 El Brillo Way, which looks like it was undergoing a down-to-the-bare-bones renovation as of February of last year, in 2024. I wonder if they found any cameras or perhaps a digital video recorder in there. Anyways, check this out. According to one of Epstein's victims, Virginia Giuffre, who I will discuss soon as she is also recently deceased, Alfredo knew all about what was happening with these underage girls being brought into the house by Ghislaine Maxwell. We see in this document provided by the District Court of Southern New York in the civil lawsuit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell in 2019 that, quote, during the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein, certain household staff was deposed, which means they gave testimony under oath. Alfredo Rodriguez, who was Jeffrey Epstein's household manager, testified that the defendant, Ghislaine Maxwell, frequently stayed in Jeffrey Epstein's home and assisted with bringing in young girls to act as masseuses for Jeffrey Epstein, unquote. Which makes sense. As a house manager or butler, Alfredo would have been there all the time. Just like any rational person, he would have eventually connected the dots as to what was happening. And if there is any doubt that he didn't eventually figure it out, apparently Alfredo did tell the FBI that he, quote, knew that his former employer was engaging in sexual contact with underage girls, unquote. How surprising, right? Epstein, the degenerate wannabe billionaire, extortionist, who hung out with hundreds of girls under 18, was also a pedophile. Who would have thought? As for Alfredo, yeah, he died in Mexico at the age of 60 on December 28, 2014, from...
Attention! If you or a loved one was diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be entitled to financial compensation. Mesothelioma is a rare cancer linked to asbestos exposure.
That's right. He supposedly died from mesothelioma.
Mesothelioma
Which, if you didn't know, is a rare cancer.
is a rare cancer.
I also want to say that Alfredo certifiably did not care about the victims because he served 18 months in prison beginning in 2010 for obstructing in Epstein's initial investigation while trying to sell his copy of the Black Book for $50,000. Alfredo actually refused to give it to the prosecutors who were asking him for it. And then he actually ended up accidentally selling it to an undercover FBI agent. So where is Alfredo's copy of the Black Book, you ask? Well, interestingly enough, it was this one. All of the circled names and annotations are Alfredo's. This is the one we have come to know as Epstein's Black Book. However, as I have come to find out, we don't actually have any definitive proof that this Black Book is Epstein's, as it easily could have been Ghislaine's. If you don't share my skepticism, that's fine. Feel free to skip ahead to point number 65, which is dedicated to the Black Books. But anyways, I really think Alfredo earned his mesothelioma, if that's what actually got him. As it sounds like he knew damn well what was going on within the walls of Epstein's Palm Beach residence, and then, like many others, tried to profit off of it. Rest in peace, you fucking bozo. Point number 25, death number 3. Next up is a man by the name of Al Seckel, aka the Illusionist. Al was a science writer and gave public speeches, including a TED Talk about optical illusions.
So, what I'm going to try and do in my lecture is go a little bit further and see if I can violate your expectations in a pleasing way. I mean, sometimes expectations that are violated are not pleasant.
Now, Al wasn't very skilled at what you might call long-term business relationships, because along with being knowledgeable about optical illusions, he was also quite fond of financial ones. He had a reputation for violating all kinds of expectations in business, as he had been accused on multiple occasions of things like swindling his investors, leaving behind his unpaid debts when he moved to France, and misrepresenting his academic background. Let's just say that he wasn't a very honest guy. Al comes into the story as he was the third husband of Ghislaine's sister, Isabel Maxwell, whose marriage began in 2007 and lasted until his death in July of 2015 in France. And Al was never accused of being involved with the abuse himself, but he was involved in organizing a bizarre science conference with Epstein on Epstein's Island called Mindshift, with prominent scientists in attendance such as Murray Gell-Mann, a theoretical physicist, Leonard Mlodinow, another theoretical physicist, and Gerald Sussman, a renowned computer scientist. Supposedly, it was just some weird intellectual salon where everyone discussed cutting-edge research and consciousness. Anyways, Al was found dead at the bottom of a cliff, missing a hand and a foot, and nobody really knows why. There is actually quite a surprising lack of information regarding Al's death. The only thing I could find was this piece by The Cut, in which they wrote, quote, Seckel died just a few weeks after an article in Tablet magazine exposed his fraudulent past and his mounting debts, unquote. What I find really odd about Seckel's death is that apparently the French authorities refused to confirm his death until 6.5 years later in September of 2021. So was this a case of violating expectations within the Epstein and Maxwell families? Because apparently Isabel did have to file bankruptcy after his death. Or did he sue his cider? A lot of unknowns with this guy, so your guess is as good as mine. But being found dead at the bottom of a cliff without one of your hands and one of your feet, that's pretty fishy. Point number 26, death number 4. The man who MIT regards as the father of artificial intelligence, who attended the Mindshift conference on Epstein Island and held a conference of his own on the island in 2002, was none other than Marvin Minsky. Although unlike Seckel, Marvin was accused of sexual assault by one of Epstein's victims. Once again, this was Virginia Giuffre. At the time of the alleged abuse, Virginia would have been about 17 years old and Marvin would have been 73 years old. I think that Marvin, being a lucid physicist at the time, could have told you that 17 was less than 18. Virginia also stated that the sexual encounter was forced and that she was directed by Epstein to do it. I'm sure it was a hard directive to defy, being a 17-year-old girl on an island full of sociopathic molesters, because Virginia stated that this did happen on Epstein's Island. Despite the accusation, Marvin was never interviewed, deposed, or charged with a crime, which I find incredibly odd. They could have at least interviewed the guy, right? Marvin also never made any kind of public comment about the matter to clear his name. He just let this incredibly severe accusation go completely unanswered. And that is a common theme I am seeing when it comes to the accusations of people in Epstein's network. Nobody ever comes out and denies wrongdoing or files any kind of defamation lawsuit, aside from Alan Dershowitz. I know if I were accused of this shit, I would be doing both of these things the very next day. I would be launching lawsuits like crazy. MIT News reported that Marvin Minsky passed away on January 24th, 2016 due to a cerebral hemorrhage, a type of stroke in the brain which bleeds profusely, causing extreme pressure within the skull. Being that Marvin was 88 years old at this time lends credibility to this natural cause explanation, but if I ever see information which says otherwise, I will certainly take a look at it. Point number 27, death number 5. Okay, so I would put money on this next one being a murder. A British and American celebrity biographer by the name of Wendy Lay died on May 29, 2016 at the age of 65 by falling from the balcony of her apartment in London. This is now the third falling death since the death of Ruslana Kirsanova in 2008. So it seems like we are starting to see a pattern here. A little something called modus operandi, which means the method by which things get done. So how does Wendy get tied into the Epstein case? Well, Wendy was becoming something of a journalist. She had been going through an apparent change in her writing career, formerly and most well known for her sex manuals, whatever the fuck those are, and she had moved into doing these celebrity biographies for people she had done intense research on. According to the article by The Guardian, she actually did consider herself to be a journalist. This brings us back to the court documents provided by the District Court of Southern New York in the civil lawsuit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell. In this particular document, we have the questioning of another accuser other than Virginia, who was a girl by the name of Johanna Sjoberg. During this civil suit, Johanna was cross-examined by Ghislaine's defense attorney, a woman by the name of Laura Menninger. The transcripts from that cross-examination reveal this line of questioning from Menninger, and these answers from Johanna. Menninger asks, quote, "Other than John Connolly and the police, who else have you spoken to about your experience?" Unquote. Johanna replies with, quote, "Well, the woman from the Daily Mail. Her name is Wendy Lay." Unquote. Then there is some kind of a clarification about the relevant exhibit number before Menninger follows up with, quote, "Did Wendy Lay accurately report your statements?" Unquote. To which Johanna affirms, quote, "She did a little bit of embellishment as well, but the facts are all true." Unquote. So it looks like Wendy, in her bid to become a serious journalist, had stumbled upon Jeffrey Epstein's PDF file network, something that increasingly seems to result in
fatality.
Because everyone who knew Wendy, including her ex-husband of 19 years, Steve Carton, and her agent, Daniel Strone, found it very hard to believe that she would commit suicide. And if you look at the date of this testimony given by Johanna, which was on May 18th, 2016, it's literally only 11 days later that Wendy fell from her balcony. Also, hold on to that other name given by Ghislaine's defense attorney, John Connolly, because Johanna spoke to him as well, and well, he's fucking dead, so we will get to him soon. Point number 28, death number 6. The next death that occurred was on May 30th, 2017, and was a woman named Leigh Patrick, sometimes referred to as Leigh Sky Patrick. Leigh was one of Epstein's accusers and accused him of coercing her into having sex with him when she was only 16 in 2003. According to Leigh's friends and family, what happened between Leigh and Epstein had done serious psychological damage to her. In fact, they say what Epstein had done was so damaging that it was mainly responsible for what they called a chain of events, which included an addiction to heroin that was the alleged cause of her death. Nearly 15 years after the abuse, Leigh passed away at the age of 29. Her body was found in a motel in Palm Beach, Florida, and her death was ruled as an accidental overdose. Given the time frame of the abuse, this would have put Leigh at the 385 El Brio property mentioned earlier, the one where Alfredo Rodriguez worked as a butler. Her death came almost exactly 1 year after Wendy Leigh's death in 2016, and almost 2 years prior to Epstein's arrest in 2019. While the circumstances surrounding her death all point to an overdose, she still serves as a grave reminder of just how evil monsters like Jeffrey Epstein and those who were within his network can be. It also reminds us of the lasting impact this kind of abuse can leave on their victims. Point number 29, death number 7. Next up is a very interesting death. a decorated Palm Beach detective who had investigated Epstein, ultimately leading to Epstein's first conviction in 2008. The detective's name was Joe Recarey, who died on May 25, 2018, almost exactly 1 year after Leigh Patrick and 1 year prior to Epstein's second arrest. Man, something about the months of May and June are just not good months if you know Jeffrey Epstein. Anyways, Joe died at only 50 years old after a sudden illness. And that's all I could find. A sudden illness. Because even 7 years later, there has been no official disclosure of his precise cause of death. Nothing even close to a disclosure. All you will find if you look into Joe's death are some unverified claims by users on Reddit claiming he died to sleep apnea. What's even weirder is that there is pretty much zero media coverage about the sudden death of this detective, despite his role in the initial conviction of Epstein in 2008. You'd think that dying at 50, given those circumstances, would warrant some coverage, due to the fact that media covers all kinds of irrelevant garbage.
I've been told, specifically from my producer, not to do an impression of a peacock, so I'm going to do it anyway. There we go. How amazing is that?
Good work, BBC. The only thing I did find was this article by the Palm Beach Daily News, which simply talked about his career and his relationships. Apparently, he was a pretty good dude. Point number 30. Death number 8. The next death moves us into the post-Epstein era. A banker by the name of Thomas Bowers who died on November 19, 2019 at the age of 55 years old, just 3 months after Epstein's death in August. Thomas worked for a bank called Deutsche Bank at one of their branches in Los Angeles as a wealth manager for high net worth individuals, and he had actually become known for signing off on some very large and unconventional loans for Donald Trump, of all people. These loans to Trump eventually became unpaid loans that amounted to around $360 million before his first presidential campaign in 2016. But when it comes to Epstein, there is a lack of information regarding Epstein's relationship with Thomas, and whether or not they had actually ever met, or whether Donald Trump was potentially involved in their relationship. Thomas makes the list because at the time of his death, there were many rumors circulating that his death was related to everything that was going on with Epstein's network. But rumors were all that I could find. People here and there talking about how Thomas had apparently signed off on hundreds of millions of dollars worth of loans, not just for Trump, but for Epstein as well, before his death. So we don't know if he was involved with Epstein, but I see the reason for rumors, because here's what we do know. We know that Thomas's role was to act as a wealth manager for the bank's wealthiest clients, a classification Jeffrey Epstein would have been in. We know that at the time of Thomas's death, Deutsche Bank was under investigation by the FBI for major fraud, with investigators from the FBI attempting to subpoena Thomas to see what his role in it was, but also if he had any dealings with Epstein. And we know that his death, an apparent suicide by hanging in his home in Malibu, California at the age of 55, came just 3 months after Epstein's hanging in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. There is also no record that the FBI was ever actually able to reach Thomas to question him before his death in 2019. So what I find most bizarre about this whole situation is that this guy was lending tons of money to both Donald Trump and Epstein, and then the two of them are suddenly dead within 3 months of one another. Pretty fucking weird, right? Point number 31. Death number 9. The next death on our list was Epstein's final cellmate at the correctional center, a man by the name of Epstein Nuke, who died on November 27, 2020, about 1 year after Thomas Bowers. According to this article by Prison Legal News, Epstein had been questioned extensively by the FBI, who were investigating the facility after Epstein's death. Apparently, Epstein told the investigators that Epstein had been abused by both prison staff and other inmates, where prison staff would force him to sleep on the floor, and other inmates were making attempts to extort him for money. Well, allegedly, he had contracted COVID-19 during his time in the Manhattan Correctional Center and died shortly after departing it at his mother's apartment in the Bronx. So he contracted it at the correctional center, was transferred somewhere, but then I guess was released, went back to his mother's apartment in the Bronx, and then died. This just doesn't sit right with me, because when we look back at the COVID-19 mortality rates for people in Epstein's age group, we now know that they were exceedingly low, somewhere between 0.5 and 1%. A very convenient fate for a man in middle age who knew a lot of details about the circumstances within the special housing unit specifically in the days leading up to Epstein's death. I also want to add that it looks like Epstein never sought hospitalization or any kind of medical intervention, which is also odd, because according to this CDC weekly report in 2022, only 15% of people who died from the virus did so at home like Epstein did. To put this in perspective, for Epstein's age group, this meant that only 75 people out of 100,000 who contracted COVID-19 would end up both dying from the virus and be at their home when they died. This is equivalent to a 0.075% of the people in his age group. Given these details, you could say that there is a very high probability that this story regarding Epstein's death is false. Point number 32, death number 10. Now, this one gets a bit messy because there is a lot going on, so try to stick with me here. But we have yet another balcony jumper, and this guy was actually a pretty big deal. We're talking about Steve Bing, the big-time Hollywood producer and financier who was involved in the making of movies like The Big Bounce, Kangaroo Jack, and The Polar Express. Steve was found dead on June 22nd, 2020 on the street below his 27th floor high-rise apartment. Now, there is no real evidence Steve Bing and Jeffrey Epstein were directly doing business together, or that they even knew each other personally. But there is a reason for all the rumors that spawned after Steve's death. The rumors began because shortly after Steve's death, a very direct post was allegedly made on Facebook by, and try to stick with me here because it's a bit complicated, the aunt of a woman named Alexanne Mitchum, who was another woman by the name of Carrie Mitchum. And for context, Alexanne was basically just another one of Steve's lovers. So we have the aunt of one of Steve's lovers making this Facebook post. In the Facebook post, according to The Mirror, a United Kingdoms-based news outlet, Carrie stated the following in her Facebook post. Quote, Steve also knew Jeffrey Epstein. They weren't close, and Steve didn't hang out with him, but a little over a year ago, Alexanne convinced Steve to make a statement via his attorneys telling them what he did know. Now, I could not locate this Facebook post, but man, is this weird. And here is where things get even worse. Somehow, Alexanne is also dead by yet another overdose, which happened on July 3rd, 2019 at the age of 28, just 1 month prior to Epstein's death. Allegedly, Alexanne took a Xanax pill which was laced with fentanyl after meeting with Steve to resolve an argument they had about something a few days prior on June 26th. Bro, what the fuck is going on here? Okay, I know this is a tangled mess, so let's go through this chronologically real quick, starting with the pressure to speak out about Epstein on Steve by Alexanne. So firstly, Alexanne's aunt, Carrie, says that Alexanne convinced Steve to go through his attorneys and make a statement about Epstein. I don't know when Steve made this statement, but fast forward to June 26th. Steve and Alexanne have a falling out about some unknown issue. Then, a few days later, Steve and Alexanne meet up and make up, which basically means they resolve their issue. But before Steve and Alexanne even get back to their Palm Springs house after this conversation, Alexanne takes a Xanax pill which just so happened to be laced with fentanyl, causing her to die from an overdose on July 3rd, 2019.
What?
Over the course of the next year, Carrie claims to have visited Steve multiple times and reported that on one particular visit he said, quote, and the guilt, unquote, saying she knew exactly what he meant. What? Then a little over 1 year later, on June 22nd, 2020, Steve jumps off the balcony of his 27th floor apartment. And I will end by coming to this excerpt by Town & Country magazine, who said they interviewed Steve's closest friends and family after he died, in which they told the magazine, quote, long-buried secrets were catching up to him, unquote. So excuse me, but I can't help but feel as though maybe Steve was trying to solve some problem with Alexanne pressuring him to disclose what he knew about Epstein to his attorneys in a bit of a, I don't know, Clinton-esque fashion. I guess you could say he may have had a Clinton-y kind of role in Alexanne's death. I mean, come on. The Xanax pill she took just happened to be laced with fentanyl, right after she had recently been pushing Steve to disclose what he knew. Oh, and by the way, yeah, Bill Clinton loved this guy. Point number 33, death number 11. Point 33 brings us yet another dead detective, or rather former detective, as John Connolly had actually long since taken to investigative journalism before his death on January 7, 2022, at the age of 78. According to Roger Friedman, a longtime friend and peer of John's, John had moved on from being a detective and had actually been doing investigative journalism at least 30 years prior to his death. This makes any direct involvement in Epstein's case highly unlikely. However, it is likely that John applied everything he learned as a detective when he decided to look into Epstein's life and help write a book called Filthy Rich, A Powerful Billionaire, the sex scandal that undid him and all the justice that money can buy. The shocking true story of Jeffrey Epstein, which was published on October 10, 2016. The title is long and self-explanatory, and the book itself contains a lot of vivid and disturbing details, as well as criticism about the legal privileges displayed by those with wealth, and even contains some accounts from some of the girls who were abused by Epstein. It's safe to say that this was a very potent expose, the kind that you never want written about you. So what happened to our detective journalist here? How did he die? Well, just like Joe Riccieri, the detective in Palm Beach, Florida, John died of a sudden illness, according to John's partner, Dorothy Carvello, with no other available information anywhere online. Since there are essentially zero details regarding John's death, leaving me with nothing to go off of, I would like to say that the period of time directly leading up to John's passing was an extremely eventful time in the Epstein story thus far. Firstly, 2 weeks prior to John's death in December of 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was finally convicted of her child sex trafficking charges. 2 days after Ghislaine's conviction, both guards who hadn't been following protocol, Michael Thomas and Tova Noel, had all their charges dropped. A few days after that, Prince Andrew made what to me is a damning argument that we will get into in the point I have about him, because it caused a huge stir in the legal world. A stir that 10 days later resulted in no dismissal of the case, and also in Prince Andrew being stripped of all of his military titles, as well as the title of His Royal Highness. Ugh. So yes, while there is no information regarding John's exact cause of death, I do find it interesting that his death came at a time where both Prince Andrew's and Ghislaine Maxwell's trials were at their most intense points. Point number 34, death number 12. If we fast forward a single month during all this excitement in the Epstein story with Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, we get our next death. And this man was very, very involved in the Epstein ordeal. We have Jean-Luc Brunel, who died in a prison cell in Paris on February 9th, 2022. Brunel had been a modeling scout for much of his career for a modeling company called Karen Models, before forming his own with his brother and other associates in 1989 called The Next Management Company. But Jean Brunel and his brother were only 25% owners in this company. So in 2004, Brunel decided to start one completely on his own. And where do you think he got all the startup capital for that? That's correct, Jeffrey Epstein, as Brunel had been introduced to Epstein by Ghislaine Maxwell sometime during the 80s. According to Wikipedia, Brunel received up to $1 million from Epstein at the time in order to start his company, an investment that would unfortunately come to bear more than one type of fruit, as Brunel would end up traveling to Epstein's island at least 25 times and visit Epstein during his first incarceration in 2008 over 70 times. But here's where the music stopped and the party became a nightmare. Enter once again Virginia Giuffre, who accused Brunel in 2014 of having sex with her in a coerced manner while underage, given a directive by Ghislaine to do so. After this, the accusations against Brunel began rapidly piling up. Brunel's reputation did not hold up, as 60 Minutes even went in and did a whole segment about the issue of sexual assault in the industry, in which multiple models dropped his name, saying that they were routinely drugged and sexually abused. And after 6 years of allegations, Brunel was arrested in December of 2020, as he was attempting to flee the country, as a matter of fact. It kind of sounds like someone tipped him off. Either way, he was taken to the Les Santé prison in Paris to await his trial. However, even after 2 years, Brunel had yet to be convicted like Ghislaine, and instead was found hanging in his cell in February of 2022 at the age of 75. Which is eerily similar to Epstein's fate, of course. Now, out of everyone on this list, Brunel's death is by far the most believable as having been what we were told that it was, which is that it was a simple suicide by hanging. However, I want to say that the French government never released any pictures of his body, any of the videotapes from the prison, and they told the public that every protocol and procedure had been followed. In this article by ABC News, we get the only substantial statement from the French government made pertaining to what went on inside the prison the day of Brunel's death. And the statement given basically just said that everything was normal and that he killed himself, because they investigated themselves and found nothing out of place. I also want to bring up that Brunel had been in prison for 2 years at this point, and decided to off himself coincidentally at the height of both Ghislaine and Prince Andrew's trials. I think that point is just very interesting, that you have this cluster of activity surrounding Epstein's crimes with Prince Andrew and Ghislaine, and suddenly a detective is dropping dead and Jean-Luc Brunel apparently is hanging himself. Point number 35. Death number 13. This one goes to a man with very interesting circumstances surrounding his death. This is Mark Middleton, who died on May 7th, 2022 at the age of 59. Mark was considered to be both a lawyer and a businessman who ended up working for Bill Clinton's presidential campaign as Clinton was the governor of Arkansas at the time, where Mark grew up and started his career. Once Clinton won the election in 1992, Mark would go on to serve as Clinton's special assistant, and he had many duties as special assistant. But one role in particular establishes our link to Epstein. Mark was responsible as acting as a liaison for Clinton's donors. It was Mark's duty to establish and maintain these relationships with Clinton's donors and to see that their needs were met when they visited the White House. As such, Mark approved most of Epstein's visits to the White House between 1993 and 1995. A number which totaled up to at least 17 visits in that period. In addition to approving Epstein's visits with Clinton and ensuring that Epstein was tended to when visiting the White House, you should also know that Mark actually attended a flight with Epstein and Donald Trump on May 15, 1994, which departed from Palm Beach, Florida, and arrived at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport in Washington, D.C., roughly 2 hours later. I could not find any reason as to why Epstein, Donald, and Mark ended up on this plane together for this flight, but I have to say it's quite the interesting combination, given how things have evolved with this situation since. Halfway through Clinton's term in 1995, Mark left his role in the White House and went back to Arkansas to work as a president for MidCorp Capital, which has to be the most fucking soulless corporation name I've ever heard. I couldn't even find the company logo, so I had ChatGPT make me this one, which is based on the way it makes me feel when I hear it. Anyways, Mark also began working once again for his family's HVAC company, Middleton Heat and Air, where he had worked prior to being involved with Big Bill Clinton. Mark remained in this role with minor disruptions for nearly 30 years until his death in 2022, which was a pretty goddamn weird death if you ask me. He was found at a ranch 30 miles from his home, hung with an extension cord and a shotgun blast to his chest. Now, in the field of psychology, this is referred to as a complex suicide, which, according to this textbook on forensic pathology, is when, quote, 2 or more methods are employed simultaneously in order to make sure that death will occur even if one method fails, unquote. Interestingly, the textbook also goes on to enlighten us by saying, quote, from the criminological point of view, the presence of several injuries of different origins strongly suggests infliction by another person, unquote. And the textbook also notes that, quote, differentiation is possible only if autopsy, including toxicological analysis, is performed and the traces at the death scene are thoroughly investigated, so that the sequence of events can be reconstructed, unquote. However, differentiation between murder and suicide has been made nearly impossible, as according to the Arkansas Times, quote, Circuit Judge Alice Gray granted a request from Mark's family to seal all photos, all videos, and all other visual content in the investigation of his apparent suicide, unquote. The article also goes on to explain that the order given by the judge allows for Freedom of Information Act requests, but requests cannot be made for any information obtained by the sheriff's or coroner's investigations, which is exactly the stuff that you would need to determine what actually happened to Mark according to the world of forensic pathology, in order to establish the order of events. Oh well, I guess, another suicide that the public is not allowed to form their own opinions about. Point number 36, death number 14. For our next point, we have an incredibly moral man, an ethically ascendant angel of goodness. I'm kidding. We're talking about fucking Stephen Hoffenberg, who was found dead in his apartment in Derby, Connecticut on August 23rd, 2022, in what authorities called an advanced state of decomposition. Now, Stephen was definitely one of the largest fraudsters in American history, as he had established a debt collection agency called the Tower Financial Corporation, which actually turned out to be a nightmarish, hellishly large Ponzi scheme, which ended up swindling upwards of $475 million from its investors. Good job, Stephen. So how did this saint end up in the realm of Epstein? Well, he first met Epstein in 1987, introduced through a mutual associate named Douglas Leese. Douglas gave a ringing endorsement of Jeffrey Epstein, telling Hoffenberg that, quote, "The guy is a genius. He's great at selling securities, and he has no moral compass," unquote. Which apparently gave Hoffenberg a huge stiffy, because he immediately hired Epstein, paying him $25,000 a month or $300,000 per year, and also gave Epstein a small loan of $2 million, which he reportedly did not ever have to pay back. Sounds more like a sign-on bonus to me, but whatever. Over the next 6 years, Epstein and Hoffenberg would sail the 7 sins of corporate schemery together. In one instance, I guess they conducted what is called a corporate raid against Pan Am, which is essentially where you buy enough stocks of a public company to be a majority shareholder on the board of that company, and then force the company to make major short-term profit, often at the expense of long-term sustainability, then conduct a major liquidation rug pull so the big corporation falls backwards and smacks its head on the cement. But apparently, it failed in this case, in large part due to a terrorist bombing of one of Pan Am's flights during this time. Scary stuff, man. Hoffenberg and Epstein would also later conduct another unsuccessful corporate raid on the Emory Air Freight Corporation. It sounds like they had a major skill issue with these corporate raids. They flew everywhere together in Hoffenberg's private jet, using all the Ponzi scheme money that the Tower Financial Corporation was able to accumulate to basically go around doing whatever the hell they wanted for 6 years until 1993, when the Tower came crashing down, when the SEC began revealing what the corporation was really up to, which was, losing a shit ton of money. At this point, even though he was heavily involved, Epstein, being the slippery little shit weasel he was, fucking Jeffrey Teflonstein, he had already ditched the situation and was never charged, despite a handful of other prison sentences being handed out to high-level executives in the corporation and a claim from Hoffenberg that Epstein was his uncharged co-conspirator. Hoffenberg also went on to state that Epstein had major traction with the Department of Justice and told reporters, quote, "You cannot grasp the magnitude of Epstein's controlling effect," unquote. I want to remind you that this was the time during which Bill Clinton was the sitting president, and as we already covered, Clinton and Epstein had frequent meetings at the White House, which started in the same year as the tower collapse that began in 1993. Hoffenberg would go on to serve 18 years in prison and was released in 2013, just 9 years before his death, which we will now get into. Hoffenberg was found deceased on August 23, 2022 after a phone call from, believe it or not, one of Epstein's accusers, a girl named Maria Farmer. Apparently, Hoffenberg and Maria had a very close relationship, almost considering one another to be like family after Hoffenberg had supported Maria through her cancer treatments. And apparently, Maria's sister Annie had also been abused, as she gave testimony in 2021 against Ghislaine Maxwell. It just never fucking ends with these people, I swear to God. Anyways, after Maria called in the welfare check for Hoffenberg, authorities discovered him deceased in his home in a morbid state of decay. According to the Derby Police Department in their Facebook post, the state of Hoffenberg had progressed to the point where visual identification could not be made, and that an initial autopsy did not reveal any signs of trauma. According to Maria, Hoffenberg had tested positive for COVID-19. However, referring back to this graphic made by Business Insider from the CDC's reported COVID death rates, people in Hoffenberg's age group had just a 4.3% mortality rate on average. And again, other than being tested for COVID, there is no record of Hoffenberg ever seeking any medical intervention, which puts him in an even smaller and less probable group. So without anything more to go on, I think Hoffenberg may have held ill feelings for Epstein, as Epstein had left the tower company just prior to the SEC's investigation, likely tipped off by people in his network, leaving Hoffenberg to take the full brunt of the fall. Hoffenberg was also apparently very close with Maria and Annie Farmer, both victims of Epstein's sex trafficking network. This does make me wonder if he had taken up some kind of position against the Epstein sex cabal even after Epstein was reported dead, which makes me wonder if something happened to Hoffenberg that wasn't COVID-19. Point number 37, death number 15. We have another deceased victim named Carolyn Andriano, who died May 23, 2023 at the age of just 36. According to authorities, Carolyn's body was found in a motel in Palm Beach, but for some reason, They didn't report this publicly until the week this article by USA Today was written, which we can see was in October of 2023. So almost 5 months had gone by before the authorities decided to disclose her death to the public. What the fuck? Unfortunately, Carolyn's fate almost perfectly resembles that of Leigh Patrick's. She was abused by Epstein in 2001 at the age of 14 and later became addicted to drugs, largely to block out the mental anguish brought upon her by Epstein's sexual abuse. In the court documents provided by the District Court of Southern New York in Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal trial in 2021, we are informed that, quote, Carolyn performed over 100 sexualized massages for Epstein when she was between 14 and 18 years old, unquote. And then goes on to describe some even worse stuff that I don't want to include in this video. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that according to this document, which you can look into yourself for the details, Ghislaine had absolutely taken a part in physically and sexually abusing Carolyn, as well as many of the other girls. Ghislaine didn't just find these girls and coax them into being abused, she actively participated in the abuse itself as well in many cases. But getting back to Carolyn's death, I personally find it very odd that the Palm Beach Police Department took 5 months to publicly disclose this, and her family seems to be extremely discontent with the information they've been given as well. If we look at this article by the New York Post, we see that her family, after all these months, still had many questions regarding Carolyn's death, with her mother saying, quote, nobody's giving me answers, and you know what? I'm over it. Unquote. Which is also very odd to me considering that this is Carolyn's family we're talking about. For a simple overdose death, you'd expect that they could get whatever information they wanted regarding the death of someone in their immediate family. Carolyn's brother also recounts a phone call early in the morning on the day of Carolyn's death, in which he said, quote, a couple times I talked to her on the phone. She just sounded real out of it, like groggy, and he was doing most of the talking for her, unquote. And also that, quote, she was never like that, unquote. So whatever issue Carolyn was having, it was present very early on in the day and persisted into the night, which is where the official story we are given took place about her having an overdose on a mix of methadone, fentanyl, and Xanax, and that Carolyn began puking before falling unconscious. It would be great to interview Carolyn's then husband, John Pitts, the one her brother was referring to see if the puking was a persistent thing throughout the day, if she was running a fever or any number of things that could confirm if it wasn't something else that ended up killing Carolyn. But for now, that's all we have. Point number 38, death number 16. Our next deceased individual was a man named Bill Richardson, who died on September 1st, 2023. Richardson served as the governor of New Mexico from 2003 to 2011, a total of 8 years. Interestingly, prior to Richardson becoming the governor of New Mexico, he had actually worked for former President, guess who?
Bill Clinton.
As both an ambassador to the United States as well as a Secretary of Energy. Man, is it getting Clinton-y in here? So, let's get right into the Epstein stuff then, because Bill also served in Congress as a representative for New Mexico for 14 years. But who really cares about that when we have strong ties to Clinton, accusations, and no public cause of death? So just to start, we're going back yet again to the civil suit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell, where in this particular document, we see that Virginia Giuffre listed Bill Richardson specifically as one of the people she was directed by Ghislaine to have sex with, along with a few other people, many of which are now dead. Later on in this document, Virginia brings up Richardson again, telling Ghislaine's defense attorney that she was sent, or rather trafficked, to New Mexico for the purpose of being sexually exploited. I'd like to point out once again that this lawsuit took place in May of 2016. And once again, no public statement from the accused, no defamation suit or desire for restitution from Richardson. All we got was a statement from Richardson's attorney and a statement from Richardson claiming to offer his help with the investigation. Although he never explained how he would help and never came out with a statement denying the accusations on his own. So let's move on to his death. It bothers me that despite this guy working in the White House, acting as a state representative in Congress for 14 years, and serving as a state governor for 8 more years on top of that there is zero information out there regarding Bill Richardson's cause of death, which is par for the course at this point, because while making this video, I've come to realize that there is very little, if no information at all, regarding the cause of death for any of these people. I can find everything about their personal lives and association with Jeffrey Epstein, but very little about their often early deaths. They either jump from their apartment balcony, overdose, or die of natural causes, with no explanation about how natural it really was. Why is it when I look up just about anyone else, such as former Senator Alan Simpson, who recently passed, I am at least told that he had a broken hip that he never recovered from, which led to his death? If I look up Dianne Feinstein, I am at least told that she finally succumbed to a condition known as cerebral amyloid angiopathy. When I look up someone like Ozzy Osbourne, rest in peace, the Prince of Darkness, I am at least told that he died of a heart attack and that he suffered from coronary artery disease and Parkinson's. I put in next to no effort finding all the information I just listed for these people. People who are of some significance, just like Bill Richardson, or Marvin Minsky, or Steve Bing, or Stephen Hoffenberg, in which cases I get ambiguous one-line answers of COVID or suicide with extremely bizarre or improbable details and circumstances. Point number 39, death number 17. Out of all the people on this list, this individual has to be the strangest and most confusing. This point goes to a woman by the name of Nadia Marchenkova, who has been missing, not dead, just flat out missing since January of last year. I quickly came to realize that Nadia's origin story was a bit fuzzy. Actually, I should say it's confusing as all fuck. First off, I thought Czechoslovakia was still a country. It hasn't been since 1993. It's split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, two different countries. Anyways, Nadia is supposedly from Slovakia and supposedly became a model around the age of 14. I say supposedly because we have conflicting accounts of this. A woman by the name of Marita Vasquez, who worked at Jean-Luc Brunel's modeling company, the MC2 modeling agency, was responsible for getting models their visas to travel abroad as a part of her job as a bookkeeper for the company. According to Vasquez, Nadia's visa application was not accepted and fell through because Nadia wasn't actually a model. I want to note that Vasquez was secondhand to this. It sounds like she actually heard this fact from one of her coworkers. But she wasn't the only one who said this about Nadia, as according to the attorney of Epstein's victims in a court filing, Nadia was a, quote, live-in sex slave, unquote, for Jeffrey Epstein, who had been purchased by Epstein from her parents in Yugoslavia. So maybe she was a model and was picked up through Jean-Luc Brunel's company, as Vasquez worked for his company and was trying to get her a visa, or maybe that was a lie to cover for the purchase of Nadia as a sex slave as detailed by Epstein's other victims. Either way, Nadia, unlike Epstein's other victims, would come to serve a particular role in his network, because at some point in the early 2000s, Nadia began flight school in Palm Beach, and it was shortly thereafter that Epstein began paying for the training necessary for Nadia to receive her Gulfstream II rating, which is a very expensive certification to fly a specific group of aircraft that can run students $10,000 or more to obtain. With this under her belt, the line between victim and abuser really began to blur for Nadia. Nadia, for example, was never grouped in with the other victims by the media. She never opposed Epstein or Ghislaine in a civil or criminal trial. Also, according to this Supreme Court docket, she was actually granted immunity, along with 3 other women who we will get to later on, in the case that they were all potential co-conspirators with Epstein. And to put the cherry on top, Nadia, in her 2010 deposition during Epstein's civil suit with his victims, pled the fifth at least 42 times for any and all questions, including those about the involvement of people such as Prince Andrew, Alan Dershowitz, and Bill Clinton. Nadia would go on to create a company called Aviloop, which seems like this weird entity that does just about anything related to aviation. If you visit this site, you will see that this is the entirety of it. It has no clickable links and goes absolutely nowhere other than referencing LinkedIn, while providing no information on how to find them on there. Apparently, they also had a YouTube channel which features these weird short videos posted in 2011 in which young women dressed up in retro flight attendant uniforms describe various Aviloop services. Here, take a look.
Get ready to fly big boy airplanes. To purchase this deal, you must hold at least a private pilot license and a current medical certificate. Don't miss out and click on that big blue button. You know you want to.
And remember Top Gun? Clearly your attractiveness increases with every flight under your belt. Just remember to wear your aviators and pick a cool call sign, Captain.
Our membership is completely free, our deals are unbeatable, and there is no catch. So what are you waiting for, Captain? Subscribe to our newsletter and get in the loop.
Something about these videos gives me the feeling that there was way more going on with Avaloop than what is described on their website. I mean, the site itself feels like a front for something else entirely, as it is completely devoid of information regarding their offered services. Anyways, fast forward to last year, 2024, 5 years after Epstein's death, and Nadia suddenly just disappears. This article, published by CNN shortly after Nadia's disappearance, noted that pressure had been mounting to hold everyone, including the women who assisted Epstein, accountable for their actions. So this makes sense, given the circumstances I described about being accused of being a co-conspirator and pleading the fifth. Nadia's disappearance came very shortly after the final and largest release of over 900 pages of files pertaining to the civil defamation suit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell, which was released on January 9th, 2024. In this document called Exhibit 6, Nadia's name is spoken in transcripts 116 times, in which she is described as Epstein's assistant. If you ask me, Nadia is probably dead, but no one really knows, because there is no information on her whereabouts whatsoever. But I think it's safe to say that if you contact Avaloop for a consultation, you won't be getting one. Point number 40, death number 18. You've probably noticed that we have been talking about Virginia Giuffre quite frequently throughout this video, and that's probably because she has been by far the most vocal victim of Jeffrey Epstein so far. Virginia Giuffre died at the age of 41 on April 24th, 2025, just 6 months ago. Before we get into her personal details and her death, I would like to enumerate the number of instances in which she pushed back against this pedophile cabal for reference. The first instance, in 2014, Virginia formally reignites the crusade against Jeffrey Epstein by filing what are called Crime Victim Rights Act documents in Florida. The next year, in 2015, Virginia files the defamation lawsuit that I have referenced multiple times against Ghislaine Maxwell. Then, in 2019, Virginia gives an interview with the BBC in which she drops the bomb on Prince Andrew. 2 years later, in 2021, Virginia files a lawsuit against Prince Andrew under New York's Child Victims Act. Later on in 2021, Virginia founds a nonprofit called Speak Out, Act, Reclaim, or SOAR for short. A few months later in 2022, the suit against Prince Andrew concludes with an out-of-court settlement. And this year, in 2025, even after her death, a memoir called Nobody's Girl has been released, which gives even more details regarding her accusations and abuse. Now I am going into a pseudo-biography of sorts as it relates to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Virginia was born in 1983 in Sacramento, California, and apparently had a pretty messed up childhood, as she was first abused by a family friend starting at the age of just 7 years old. This issue apparently went unresolved, which led to Virginia running away from home and ending up in foster care. By age 14, Virginia was living on the streets and ended up living with another sex trafficker named Ron Eppinger for 6 whole months. However, this came to an end when Ron was raided by the FBI and arrested. Still 14, Virginia went back to live with her father, who was a maintenance manager at, guess where? Mar-a-Lago, baby. This is where Virginia unfortunately ended up meeting Ghislaine Maxwell. And by 2001, she says she had been trafficked to Prince Andrew when she was still 17. In her BBC interview, Virginia spoke about this encounter with Prince Andrew, concluding with this.
He got up and he said thanks and walked out, and I sat there in bed just horrified and ashamed. It was a wicked time in my life. It was a really scary time in my life. I had just been abused by a member of a royal family.
Imagine being 17 and having someone that high up on the world stage do this to you. This is absolutely insane, but this shows us how Epstein's network operated. It's like a prostitution service, only it's the elites, and they abuse underage girls from all over the world. And you can see the kind of leverage over people that someone like Epstein would come to possess, as Prince Andrew was damaged immensely by the lawsuit filed by Virginia. But we will get to those details later on because I have a whole point dedicated to this sack of shit. It was at this point in 2002 that Virginia left the States for Australia and actually started a family there. But unfortunately, her newfound peace would be disrupted in 2007 as she began getting calls from the Palm Beach Police Department, as well as Epstein and Ghislaine, because apparently Epstein had royally fucked up 2 years prior in 2005 and now had detectives crawling a mile up his ass. Despite Epstein and Ghislaine's meddling, Virginia did end up summoning immense courage and strength and would end up talking to the Australian Federal Police about Epstein's trafficking crimes, something I'm sure that she did not want to do. But it all worked out at the time, as Epstein ended up getting charged and convicted of 2 separate crimes relating to prostitution of minors. Epstein would go on to serve a luxurious 13 months in prison, of course, but at least he was a convicted felon. It was from there that Virginia would go on over the next 15 years to file suits against Ghislaine Maxwell and Prince Andrew, and file Crime Victim Rights Act documentation against Epstein, which was largely responsible for lighting Epstein on litigatory fire once again, which would end up with him dying in prison, likely by murder. So, she had a terrible childhood and fought back and won. She set up a non-profit organization to help other victims of sexual abuse speak out, and she wrote a memoir that released in October of this year. But how did she die? Well, as usual with Epstein's accusers, it's not very straightforward. Let's start by going to December 10th, 2019, where Virginia makes this post on X 4 months after Epstein's death. She says that she is not suicidal and that too many evil people want her dead. Keep this post in mind as we move forward 4 years to March 22nd, 2025, just a month before Virginia's death. Virginia makes this odd post on social media in which she says her kids are being poisoned with lies and says, quote, "Hurt me, abuse me, but don't take my babies. My heart is shattered, and every day that passes, my sadness only deepens," unquote. Then, on March 31st, 2025, 4 weeks before her death, Virginia makes this post on Instagram. She clearly looks injured, and she says she was in her car a week prior when it was struck by a school bus traveling at 68 miles per hour. However, after this incident, apparently authorities could not make it out to the scene, and had advised any injured parties to make their way to the hospital. In fact, Australian officials put out a statement saying that there were no serious injuries and that no one was taken to a hospital. Now, this is where things start getting weird. In the same post, which was posted the day after the accident, Virginia also states that she has gone into kidney failure and has been given just 4 days to live. But wait, according to authorities, this was a minor accident. This is what starts leading me to believe that this post she made was an attempt to frame her injuries and supposed kidney failure on this accident with a school bus. And I say supposed because that's not actually what she ends up dying from. Things just keep getting weirder as we move forward 5 days to April 5th, where in an interview with People magazine, Virginia says, quote, "I was unable to escape the domestic violence in my marriage until recently. After my husband's latest physical assault, I can no longer stay silent," unquote. So there were also major problems going on at home, where Virginia alleges that she was being physically abused by her husband. But they hadn't been living together for quite some time, as 4 days later on April 9th, we learned that Virginia Giuffre had missed a court date for violating a restraining order, because apparently her ex-husband Robert Giuffre had filed a successful restraining order against Virginia in early 2025, even though it was revealed by Virginia's family that on January 9th of 2025, shortly before her husband filed that restraining order against her, that she was assaulted by Robert, her husband, on a family vacation, an assault in which she suffered a cracked sternum and a perforated eye and had to go to the hospital. So at this point, I am wondering what the actual fuck is going on here. Virginia says she was hit by a school bus, but authorities claim it was a minor accident, which is corroborated by the bus driver. Virginia and her family are saying she was abused by her now ex-husband Robert, but for some reason, her ex-husband has a successful restraining order against her. And not only was the restraining order successful, but it was also responsible for separating Virginia from her children, according to Virginia's father, Sky Robert. This is all so confusing, but it's all we have to go on until Virginia's death, just 2 weeks later on April 24th. Australian authorities say they responded to a report of an unresponsive woman, Virginia Giuffre, but that she was pronounced dead at the scene. The Australian authorities, despite all these bizarre circumstances, say that there is nothing suspicious to them about Virginia's death. And from Virginia's family, all we get is a statement from their attorney explaining that, quote, "she lost her life to suicide," unquote. Except it sounds like her father, Sky, isn't really convinced of that. Not in the least, as he had this to say on Piers Morgan.
It's impossible. And then for them to say that she committed suicide, there's no way that she did. Somebody got to her.
I think those are pretty chilling words to hear from a father who had spent quite a bit of time with Virginia in the time leading up to her death. So yeah, her death, much like many others on this list so far, is pretty strange and honestly lacking in detail. I just don't understand how Virginia and her family claim Robert was abusing her, But somehow, Robert ends up with what sounds like a full custody of their children and a hefty restraining order in which Virginia couldn't even make a phone call. That's what she was supposed to show up to court for. She hadn't violated the restraining order by going to his house or anywhere near him. She had simply made a phone call, and that was a violation. I also don't understand what happened regarding her kidney failure, as she went on to live another 4 weeks after her accident with the school bus. And even then, it was ruled a suicide, which we still have no details on. I mean, Jesus Christ, we can't even get an exact cause of death. She just went unconscious all of a sudden, and that was it. So I guess I'll just leave it at, it's up to you to decide for yourself what happened to Virginia. But whatever happened, it sure as shit wasn't normal. Point number 41. Death number 19. We have a Harvard-educated lawyer named Stanley Pottinger, who passed away on November 27, 2024 at the age of 84. Stanley was intimately involved with the Epstein case as he was the main attorney for Virginia Giuffre and upwards of 20 of Epstein's other victims. He represented Virginia specifically on multiple occasions. Stanley joined Virginia Giuffre's legal team in 2014 when prosecutors violated Virginia's victims' rights in Florida when she was never notified of Epstein's successful non-prosecution agreement, something she was completely entitled to know. He was also a part of Virginia's legal team when she sued Ghislaine Maxwell in civil court, as he represented her during her depositions. And finally, Stanley helped write a letter on Virginia's behalf, which was addressed to Prince Andrew, just prior to the start of her civil settlement with him, in an attempt to pressure Prince Andrew to address Virginia's allegations. Things get really interesting, though, when we look at what Stanley did for an anonymous group of Epstein's accusers, who are listed by the courts as Jane Does. He was actually successful at suing 2 major banks for being integral to Epstein's network, and therefore the abuse of these women. The first bank included Deutsche Bank, who paid out a whopping $75 million, and who we know Thomas Bowers worked for before he was found hanging in his home. According to the lawsuit, Deutsche Bank had taken Epstein as a client even after a shit ton of women had filed claims of sexual assault against him, and kept giving him money for 5 years despite this and his previous convictions of child prostitution. The second bank sued was the monopoly bank JP Morgan, who settled with Epstein's victims for an insane amount of money. $290 million. My God, what kind of nasty shit did they do to get hit like that? Well, first of all, the lawsuit filed by Stanley listed over 100 women as victims within this class action lawsuit. 100 women attributed the willing negligence of JP Morgan to their abuse. Secondly, the lawsuit stated that one of JP Morgan's former employees, a man by the name of Jess Staley, who we will get to later on in the video, had, quote, observed victims personally, unquote, and that he had also, quote, visited young girls at Epstein's apartment, unquote. Absolutely fucking disgusting. But we see that Stanley was getting it done. He was very much a part of the head of the spear that was being driven into the flesh of these very powerful people. So, how did he die? According to his son Matt, Stanley died of cancer at a hospital. We don't know what kind of cancer, or with which complications, or in what time frame or hospital Stanley died. And at the age of 84, it's hard to say that there was foul play. But he's not the only attorney involved who has died recently. We have another one as the final point on this list. Point number 42, death number 20. We've had 2 detectives, 2 scientists, 2 fashion models, and 2 executives perish in the wake of Epstein. Now we have our second attorney, a man by the name of Roy Black, who died July 21st, 2025 at the age of 80. Apparently, Roy was quite a big deal. He was considered to be a legendary attorney who was often called the Professor, and has been eternalized in the Trial Lawyer Hall of Fame. Yeah, that's a real thing. This was one of those attorneys who represented a ton of A-list clients. He had clients such as Rush Limbaugh, Justin Bieber, and William Kennedy Smith. And oh yeah, Jeffrey Epstein, which is how Roy finds himself embroiled in this depraved circus of sex trafficking monsters. It was Roy who defended Epstein in Epstein's first criminal trial in 2008, after Epstein had stepped on a silo-sized underground hornet's nest and had found himself in the 9th circle of litigation hell. However, despite Epstein deserving to be in the 9th circle, Roy was actually able to pull him up and out into a more purgatory type situation, with what is now famously known as Epstein's sweetheart deal. I'll briefly go over just how good Epstein had it in jail after the non-prosecution agreement. He was allowed to leave up to 12 hours each day, during which time he was supervised by officers who he paid. He had a private wing of the jail all to himself, and his cell door was always unlocked, so he could go watch TV in the attorney room. Oh yeah, and he allegedly would go back to his mansion during the day, where he continued to meet with young women. So, excellent work, Roy. You've certainly proved your mastery over our system of justice. It really warms my heart to see you display such restraint. Now tell me, if you were to guess what killed Roy Black, would it be A, jumping from a high-rise apartment balcony, B, overdosing on fentanyl, C, hanging plus shotgun blast to the chest, or D, unexplained illness? If you guessed D, you're correct. According to Roy's law partner, Howard Srebnick, Roy died at his home in Coral Gables, Florida, after dealing with what Howard said was a serious illness. Again, no time frame, no actual cause of death, just a vague and at this point, seemingly common explanation. And I understand HIPAA laws and respect for the family, but to me it does start to seem, with almost all of these people, that there is a pattern of extremely superficial information. When I go on Google and look up how other public figures have died, it seems like I get much more information. Another example of this is the recently deceased Hulk Hogan. I looked this up just to see if the information was there. If you look this up for yourself, you immediately have some kind of an explanation. That he recently had a surgery in which his phrenic nerve, which is responsible for stimulating your diaphragm so that you can breathe, was either damaged or severed, and that many people, including his family, believed that this was responsible for a heart attack which ended up killing him. That's more verifiable information than I've seen for anyone on this list. I want to wrap up this section by saying that there is a lot that doesn't make sense. We have people's parents going public in some cases, like with accusers of Epstein who died suddenly under odd circumstances, and these parents' questions go unanswered for eternity. We have people jumping out of their apartments and falling down cliffs, missing hands and feet, despite jumping suicides being exceedingly rare. We have people contracting COVID, being in the 1 to 4% group that it is fatal for, and then also, for some reason, never going to the hospital for help, which is even more rare. We have hangings in maximum security prisons, where suicide is the norm and many prevention measures are in place, and somehow they aren't prevented. And then we also have Bill Clinton. I mean, seriously, this motherfucker came up a lot in this section. I can find exact causes of death immediately for so many other prominent people, but despite all my scouring, I came up mostly empty-handed on these individuals. And I want to point out one more thing as well. You saw a lot of press coverage for these people, sometimes specifically because of their connection to Epstein. And yet, despite all those journalists writing articles, taking a magnifying glass to the situation, often doing their job, calling in and submitting requests for more information, this is what we come up with when we look into it. We basically get a dehydrated, dusty, stale-ass nothing burger whose flavor only exists when you read between the buns.
What could be next? My skin. I nurture my skin. No, tell everyone. Do the gold bond tingle. I nurture my skin. Foot powder spray. I nurture my skin. Gold bond. No, tell it.